prioritize activities. So as we go through this, some of these concepts will be clear and obvious and agreeable to most. Some of them are contentious. And if we can focus in on those that are important to get right, we will then focus onward meetings specifically around those topics so we can get into the depth of that issue. Okay, so that's our goals. That is what we're trying to do. We're planning on doing that every week, every Wednesday, starting at 10 o'clock Eastern Time until we finish it. I will encourage everybody that if you are interested in this and you have something to say, really the best way of getting the concepts articulated is for you to call Mike Bennett directly. I put his information in this document I sent around. I included it on the email. It should be available on our website, etc. But that's the best way to get the concepts on the agenda. So Mike's task is to listen and document, present back to you what you guys have said, as well as his own opinion of how we might address that in the model. Time frames are pretty straightforward. We're starting this today, every Wednesday, 10 o'clock. We're presenting it next week to the Financial Stability Board. Documentation, I believe, Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was somewhere around mid-November. We got to have the documentation finalized for the OMG process. And then December 10th is the quarterly meeting where we hope to get this standard voted on and accepted. I will tell you up front that we have slowed down this process twice already because we wanted to make sure that the business subject matter experts had a chance to review the legal structure. It is absolutely essential that we get advanced buy-in before we do a standard, and the OMG folks agree. So if we are not there by December, we will slow it down for the next quarter, but we have this shot, and I'd like to do it because it's perfect timing in terms of rollout. So with that, that's the upfront stuff. Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to try to take notes and scroll through these documents simultaneously to keep on path. As you are talking, just simply say next slide, and I'll go to the next one. So let me pause there for a moment. Anybody have any questions? Hearing none, Mike, up to you.
Can I just say, if anyone joined later, if you are on voice over IP, your line is muted so that there's no background noise. If you're on the phone, your line should be released. John Gemsky, have you got a question there?
I think you've just answered it. He was muted.
Perfect. Okay, that's wonderful. Please raise your hands or send over a question via the control panel if you have any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Bennett.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Carol. So what I'm going to do here is really run through the basic concepts that are in the model as represented in these slightly simplified slides. And there's quite a lot to get through, so do feel free to chip in if anything is unclear. But I think we'll be looking at detailed comments on these between now and next week, and then we'll bring those questions and comments to the table and dive into the details. But what I want to do first is
Mike, let me interrupt you right up front, because the slides are not the complete specification for business entities. The complete specification exists where?
It's available on the EDM Council website via the semantics repository link. There's a downloadable model file in a tool called Enterprise Architect, and the model can be downloaded that way. There's a viewer for it and everything, or I can go through it with people, one-on-one via a web interface anytime people want to.
Good. Please continue.
Thanks, Mike. So just up front then, in the first diagram, this is a good example of how we define the concepts in the model via what we call, in technical terms, a taxonomy. That is a hierarchy of kinds of thing. Oh, that's better. And that upward pointing arrow represents that everything below the arrow is a kind of the thing above the arrow. So this is true of the entities we're focusing on now, the kinds of autonomous entity that there are, but also of other things, as we'll see. Everything in the model is disposed in that kind of way. And that's really all you need to interpret the model at this level of detail. We have each kind of thing represents a set theoretic construct, i.e. a set of things of which something may be a member. And it's important to note that in defining the semantics of things, many things like a company, for example, can be both a legal person and an organization and so on. And so this is very much not a data model design. You would probably combine many of these things in classes in a data model. What we're doing here is trying to identify and understand what are the kinds of things that are out there. So we start with what we've called an autonomous entity. This is anything that can act on its own part, whether that's a person, a company, and so on, even an animal, although they're out of scope, anything that can motivate itself and move itself, if you like. And we're focusing on four kinds of entity in this model. The human being, of course, we all know many of those. What's called a legal person, this is grounded in the legal concept of legal personhood or legal personality, and we'll focus on that in a moment as to what that really means. The organization, and you'll see a little blue line there, a fact about an organization is it has members. Now, those members might be other organizations, they might be people, they could be any kind of autonomous entity, and that's what makes something an organization. So some of the facts about something arise because they're organizations, like having subparts and so on. Other facts about things arise from their legal personhood. But finally, the fourth one you see there, the legal entity, this is a new one. We used to regard legal person and legal entity as being more or less the same thing. A legal person, as we'll see, being something that can incur debt on its own part. But there's an important requirement here, we believe, for being able to talk about anything that can sign a contract, even if the liability winds up to somewhere else. And as we go through the next few slides, we'll see how we've distinguished those two concepts in order to be able to talk about both legal personhood and the formal arrangements to bring that about, and separately to talk about something which can incur liability in the first instance as a legal entity. Hopefully that will become clear over the next couple of slides.
So Mike, is this a question still in our minds, or have we come to the conclusion that adding legal entity is essential in order to cover the use cases that are highlighted here?
Well, we're confident of the concept of legal entity. We've spoken to some legal people, but it's very much the role of this group to validate whether we've got that right. But separate from that, is that concept needed? We think it is, because the scope of legal entity identifiers includes things like partnerships and trusts and so on, which do not actually hold the liability, but which can sign contracts and open bank accounts and carry out business, and so are of interest, we believe, in the LEI. So there's really a scoping question there on legal entity. It could be that the scope of anything that can sign a contract is met by the concept of formal organization, for example. And there's also a question of whether we're interested in only legal entities that are not human beings, or how we relate those to each other, bearing in mind that none of these sets are mutually exclusive of each other, so many things will be a combination of 3 or 4 of these types of thing that we have here. So yes, So first question for everybody to think about is our interpretation of legal entity in the context of describing the types of use cases that exist in the real world, particularly as we're looking at the LEI objective. That's right. Thanks, Mike.
Mike, can I also jump in at this point with a couple of questions? Why? There's 3 questions. Why is a legal person not a legal entity? I'll say them all because you might combine the answers.
Carol, just release the person who asked the question. Let them ask. Can we do that?
Let's go down to Richard. Okay, bear with me a second. Richard Markaloff, can you speak? Can you be heard? Richard is on voice over IP, so perhaps not.
Oh, no, you don't go ahead and read. Go ahead and read it then.
Yeah. Okay. So why is a legal person not a legal entity? On the same line, why is a legal person not a subclass of legal entity? And again, from Cornelius Crowley, please explain why legal person is not a form of legal entity. What is it that results in the two being considered separately?
Okay, so same question 3 times. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, that's a very, very important questions. And part of that is, can we consider some of these things as subclasses of each other? And I think as we get to understand the properties we've defined these by over the next few slides, I think we should come back to that question and see whether that does make sense. But none of these things is not also the other thing. In other words, any individual in the world which is a legal person may also be a legal entity. In fact, it could well be that we should say it will always be a legal entity. What we've tried to do is keep it fairly flat at this point and say legal personhood is a clearly well understood concept and it's a kind of autonomous entity. But yeah, there could be mileage in exploring how we dispose the hierarchy between them. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is show what are the formal properties that we've defined these things by. So what is their definition in a sense? And then I think we should look at that. But yes, until quite recently, we simply had one concept, which was both a legal person and a legal entity, and it became clear that the scope of LEI includes things like partnerships and trusts and so on, which do not have legal personality. And so we've kept all of them distinct here so we can assert different facts about each of them. If you were doing a data model out of this, you'd probably have one class which had all the facts about all of them, but those facts would all be optional, and then you would have a simple class design for your application.
Okay, well, let's not go into it. We get it.
Sure.
That's the critical activity that we're going to explore throughout this process. Is legal entity and legal person is required to be distinct for all of the applications?
Yes.
Carol, do you have other questions?
Julian Macri, I've released your line. Can you be heard? Again, another one who's on voice over IP. Can I stress at this point, if you are on voice over IP, please can you ensure that you actually have a method to be able to communicate to us? Otherwise, it's a one-way call. The question from Julian, I agree with having legal entity. I question why it is a subclass of autonomous entity. It seems to me that legal entity is an attribute or flag of the other three.
Yes, that's a very good idea because, well, we'll see what its attribute is, and I think certainly if you're designing a data model, I think all of these would be flags or yes, no type of attributes to say, does this thing have the capacity to enter into contracts, which is what defines a legal entity. So that's a really good point. But just to stress, we're trying to tease out all the legal nuances without any kind of consideration of how you would then design a data model against this.
Okay, so Mike, let's hold that. Carol, let's keep track of the people who are raising these points. We want to follow up with them. So please, for each question, keep track of who is asking or sending a note about, so we can follow up directly.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to dig deep into this one, Mike. I think this is a critical issue for us to resolve.
Absolutely, and this is really the main reason that we're on these calls and trying to validate or rearrange these concepts. This is if you like, a straw man, as you might call it, a draft of how we think the legalities of things are, and it's really the job of this group to then feed back, what are the legal facts and have we understood them right, so that what we end up with represents the legal reality that we're after. And what I anticipate we'll do is take all of these questions and points that are raised, and those will be our agenda for next week's call, where we dive into these questions. And I think,
in the meantime, anybody who has a point of view about legal entity, relationship to legal person, if you wanted to identify yourself, send an email to Mike. Just say, you have something to say on legal entity. We will follow up with you directly to make sure we capture it.
Fantastic. And I think if we can get through what are the basic facts that we've asserted for these today, then that puts us all on the same page for when we dive into these detailed questions next week.
Good.
Another,
Continue.
I'm going to interrupt again. Another message from Murray Stephen. Would the concept of agency help here? Some LEIs can contract as agents for LPs, e.g. partnerships, trusts, nominee companies, etc. Thus, the LE may be either an LP or agent for other LPs.
So that's kind of a role-based question, Mike. You know,
yeah, no, that's perfect. That's really what we want to. I think we need to get through a lot of stuff before we can address that question. But that is a really important question, because at the moment we define these things by their capacity. We have a whole part of the model we haven't looked at on things defined by their roles, like special purpose vehicles and things like that, which I'd like to come on to in a couple of weeks. But it could be that, as well as legal capacity, something like legal agency could well be something we should be adding or refining in what we have in the model. So please hold that thought, and I really want to unpack that.
Particularly as we get to page 19, we've identified that. If you look right here, we've identified that as an open question that needs to be addressed. So
yeah,
shall we move on, or
yes,
we have
please.
more?
Yeah, I'd like to get through the basics so that everybody's on the same page, and then hopefully all of these questions will fall into place really nicely, I think.
All right, continue.
So on the next slide, then, what I've done here is extended the taxonomy a little further to show a couple of refinements of some of these things. So, for example, if an organization is defined as anything that has members that are themselves some kind of autonomous entity, I mean, that could be a school of fish, it could be anything. We distinguish between formal and informal organizations, and later on we'll go on to add some more facts about formal organizations, and the informal organization is simply the set that's mutually exclusive from that, the thing that doesn't have the kind of formal contractual arrangements that define a formal organization. And that, again, there are facts that arise from something being an organization completely independent of their legal personhood or other kinds of legal capacity. On the legal person front and the human being front, again, notice how these are all set theoretic constructs. We're now refining what are the sets of which something can be a member. So legal personhood, up until about the 17th century, human beings were legal persons, but only, of course, if they're adults. So we distinguish between a minor and a mature or adult person. There's some question about whether we should add other things like people without legal capacity but who are adults, for example, whether that's relevant. It's certainly something that would be true, but we haven't done that at this point. But then if an adult human being can be a legal person, you also have, and I'm not too wedded to the wording we've used for this, we've been struggling to find a good label for it, but the kind of legal person that's not a human being, that is the kind of legal person that is created by the existence of some statute and some instrument of incorporation that's defined under that statute, which is how we start to allocate legal personhood to things other than human beings. This, of course, is things like the company incorporated by the issuance of shares, which isolates the principles from any liability by being itself an entity that can take on liability, and that is the definition of legal personhood. And of course, there are many things like a partnership where the partners are jointly and severally liable, and it does not isolate those partners from liability because it does not have legal personality. So here we're defining that kind of thing which has legal personality, but which is not a human being. And we'll now look at some of the things that define what those things are. And if anybody's got a better label for that, that would be great. Remember, this is a semantic model. We don't particularly care about the labels as long as they're reasonably self-explanatory. The words don't carry the meanings. It's the formal facts that we're about to show you about the things that really define what their meanings are. So, next slide. So,
can I just jump in again with a couple of, sorry, I think these may be a little bit late.
Go ahead, no worries. Go ahead.
Okay. Paul Foschi, let's see if I can release your line and then you can say your comments. Bear with me a second. Paul, can you be heard?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Yes, I was able to connect. Thank you for your help.
Okay, your line's now released. Do you have any other questions?
No, thank you.
All right. Please mute yourself your end, and then you can please jump in as you need. Jacob, Jacobus, would it perhaps be a good idea to split up autonomous entity into actor, role, and relationship, where person, organisation, and system are subclasses of actor, where actors can have roles like employer or legal entity, and where roles can have relationships such as an employment contract?
Absolutely, and we have done that, but that is not on the slides we're showing at the moment. It is fundamental to the way that we define concepts like issuers, underwriters, and counterparties as being what we call a party. That is some entity in some role. That's distinct from the role itself. It's the entity in the role, the being party to a contract. So principals and counterparties to contracts are parties, and of course any legal entity being something which can enter into a contract can be the scope of party in that sense. We also have, as Mike mentioned earlier, there's a slide a bit later on where we focus in on some of this. But we also have the same concept of roles and parties when we define things like parent, subsidiary, part owner, and so on. Those are all something in some role. And as Mike's showing now, we actually use this slightly strange icon that I came up with once to represent anything which is a party. And so using this slide as an example, the party here is a shareholder. So that is something which holds some share. It is in fact one of the parties to the contract that is that share. It's the anonymous counterparty whose other counterparty is the issuer of the share. And the identity, because all things in a role, all parties, must have some kind of identity. And so the identity of some parties may be an incorporated company. Other parties, their identity could be that they could be any legal entity or any human being, etc., etc. So it's a very important concept, and we will come to it. Another thing we've done with that is we've got a whole lot of kinds of entity defined by their role in the wider world. This is subtly different, but this is things like what is a bank, what is a special purpose vehicle, what is a business versus a non-profit, because those are all things defined in their role, and the thing which can fulfill that role, in some cases must be a legal person, in other cases it can be any kind of autonomous entity, and so on. So that's a very fundamental question, and one that will hopefully make more sense once we've got through the simpler stuff.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
Paul Foshee, have you a bit more of a question? I've got a message here that says, wouldn't the fact that a human being is a minor be an attribute flag of a human being? If not, what are the attributes of a minor that are not attributes of a human being?
Right, what we're doing here is defining classes of thing. And in fact, the way that you define a subclass of something like human being, for example, is that the things that are subclasses of it are distinguished by their attributes or properties. If you're designing a data model, you would probably put a flag there and simply say is human being is a minor or isn't a minor. By creating a taxonomy of kinds of things, we can then talk about them in more detail and so on. Once we've gone through this and you can see what the different entities are, one question in any ontology is how far down to develop the taxonomy, because you could in theory have a taxonomy of classes for differences between each attribute that things have, and the question then becomes, how far down is it useful to decompose things, particularly when we come to securities, for example. There are different ways that you classify securities based on their attributes. So the thing above, you could simply have the attribute there that says, it is a minor or it isn't, and then the subclass is defined by, the values of those attributes. Hopefully that makes some sense. But again, we're trying to articulate what are the things that exist in the world. We are not trying to design a data model, but in doing this, we hope that data modelers can then look at this and say, right, I would put a flag here for this thing, and I would put a flag there for that thing, because I'm now looking at a non-designed representation of the business reality itself.
Very important to understand that we are not creating a data model. I know, Mike, you're going to say that 5 or 6 times, but it's really critical to understand that this is a definition of facts, things, and relationships between and among. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so now we introduce the incorporated company, and this is an example of where we're defining a set theoretic construct, a set of things which inherits the properties both of legal person, of legal entity, and of formal organization. So an incorporated company is all of those things. And we'll go on to look at some of the facts about those, and I think before that we'll look at the facts that define legal personhood and the facts about formal organizations and so on by virtue of their capacities. And then we'll come full circle back to the incorporated company, and we'll start to be able to look at more facts about those. The next slide, please. So here's the bit that we really want to review and make sure we've got legalities completely correct, because this is how we define legal personhood, and also how we define those legal persons that are not human beings. So we've introduced the concept of a legal capacity. Again, the label might be wrong, and I'd be very interested to hear from legal folks, but as I mentioned before, there's these hierarchies or taxonomies of every kind of thing in the model, not just of the entities. And so we've created a small taxonomy of kinds of capacity, so things like the ability to incur liability, things like the ability to sign contracts, also rights and so on. So, for example, certain human beings have rights but not obligations. We haven't modeled that, but we could. You know, what we're trying to do is define different kinds of entity based upon what kind of capacity that has. So this is quite close to what Jacob has said just now about the roles that things have. And this is something I'd really like the focus of legal folks in particular, to make sure we've got both the concepts right and the best possible labels for them. But a legal person is defined by being capable of liability. That is to say, this is something that you can sue at law, this is something that can incur debt. And a kind of legal person is one that isn't a natural person. In order to exist, there has to be some body of statute under which it is defined how you create certain kinds of artificial person, starting with the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century, and of course every incorporated company, but also other things like incorporated partnerships and so on. Anything that is incorporated in some way or has some personhood, some legal personality, but which is not itself a natural person. And after a lot of discussion on labels, we came up with legal person, natural person, and artificial person. But particularly artificial person, that label gets misunderstood by some, and it's perhaps not the best label. So I'd really like a nice legal word for that. But the concept, I hope, is clear. It is something which is constituted by some kind of instrument. And we've got, again, in the model, a taxonomy of a hierarchy of kinds of instrument by which the kinds of artificial persons that exist can be constituted. So limited liability partnerships, companies constituted by the issuance of guarantees, companies constituted by the issuance of shares, and so on. Note that some of the entities we're interested in, like trusts and partnerships and so on, non-incorporated partnerships, are not themselves legal persons, but we're still interested in them. We're still interested in them because they have some other capacity that is particularly interesting to us in the industry, and why we need to have identifiers for them. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll take a look at those characters. This is where we then introduced the separate concept specifically for LEI. Originally we thought, well, the scope of LEI can be defined as some logical union of some well-defined legal concepts like legal person and or formal organization and so on. And as the conversation around LEI has progressed, it's become clear that actually whatever else it might be, what we're interested in here is that something has the capacity to sign a contract. So what this means is that you have, say, a partnership or a trust or something that can enter into a contract with you. If they then let you down, and they then fail to maintain their obligations in that contract, you go back to them for some legal satisfaction. But the liability which they've incurred, you kind of goes to their doorstep, if you like, but then it unwinds to, for example, the partners in a partnership who are jointly and severally liable for those liabilities they've incurred. The entity itself doesn't keep that liability, but it does have the ability to enter into that contract. Again, if there's a better legal name for it, that would be great. We've called it signatory capacity, the capacity to incur liability, whether or not you're also the thing that unwinds to. And again, if we think about the earlier question about whether either one of these should be a subclass of the other, we could look at whether these kinds of capacities can be defined in terms of each other or not, and so on. For that, we really do need detailed legal knowledge. So this is our definition, anyway, of what we mean by a legal entity. Many things, as you've seen, can be both a legal entity and a legal person. The concept is now distinct so that we have a clear scope of what the LEI may refer to, and that's something we really need your expertise and knowledge on. So this is really the main thing we want to review in detail when we come to next week's detailed review and feedback session. Yes, Carol.
Thank you. A couple of things have come through. An email from Murray Stephen. 3 points from him. Artificial person, would body corporate work?
Yes.
Is one. Suggest we need some demarcation between informal organisation and a mere population, e.g. money laundering gangs versus car dealers as a class.
Good, good.
Minors and other human beings that are not legal persons must have agents, trustees, to act on their behalf, assuming they have anything to act on, and if not, they probably don't matter. Other points.
That's a really good one, because we have the ultimate beneficiary, for example, of a company of a company that has shares could be a minor, but if it is, then presumably those shares are held in some trust, and there's the whole concept of agency around the trust. And as I think about it, I think we might be able to get a lot more detail, a lot more accuracy in our model of trust by building around this concept of agency and so on. So I'm starting to see a really good future session shaping up where we get to the bottom of some of that. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay. And I like your proposed better label, and I suggest that on next week's call we try and get that get other people's views on that. Also offline between now and then, what are the most legally accurate terms for some of these things, and of course these will vary between jurisdictions. So sometimes we try and come up with a jurisdiction neutral term for some of these concepts, but I like the one that you came up with. That could well be a more accurate one.
You got more, Carol, or should we move on?
I have one more again from Ram. How is artificial legal person, that is a company, different from artificial legal entity that is company?
A legal entity could include a partnership, which is not a legal person. It doesn't have legal personality, it doesn't carry its own liability, but in every other sense it carries out business in the normal way. So yeah, I think thank you for that, and we'll definitely dive into these kind of details on the next session, because this is exactly the areas we want to focus on these reviews.
Should we continue?
Okay.
Yes, please. I want to make sure everybody's seen all of the slides of the basics, so that we're all discussing this from the same position of seeing what we've already done and what's right and wrong and so on.
Well, we should assume, Mike, that people have seen it, because we have sent it to them in advance, and they looked at it. So
good.
I have no problem going into these questions now. Although we do want to set context so that you understand everything, and but let's not cut off dialogue if it exists.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. Excellent. So here I've just done a slide that brings those two things together so that we can see legal person defined by its ability to accrue liability and legal entity defined by its signatory capacity and the artificial person there. And many of these, many things in the world will belong to more than one of these sets of things. And of course, legal persons can include natural persons, i.e. human beings. One thing that we need to think about on these reviews, and I'd like people's views on, is whether with legal entity, whether we need to distinguish between natural and artificial persons, whether we want to say that legal entities are necessarily not natural persons or anything like that. And again, some of the suggestions about disposing these within the same subclass hierarchy might well help with that question as well. So that's something I'd very much like people to think about and give us feedback on between now and the next session, so that we can get to the bottom of how we want this model to be.
Mike, I'm going to interrupt again. I have another question here, or another point from Leora. Can we incorporate in this ontology person groups such as families, couples and clubs and geopolitical entities? These don't seem to be included in the ontology.
Very good point. When we come to organizations, we'll see that we have formal organizations, and when we define that, somebody suddenly said, oh, well, then informal organizations are quite useful from a money laundering point of view, as per the previous comment as well. It may be, and this again is down to this group from the point of view of scoping, it may be that there is potential in articulating more kinds of informal organization, or putting more refinement to the nature of organization, possibly distinguishing between human organizations or companies, which would include corporate groups, of course. Geopolitical is interesting. We do have a whole geopolitical ontology. We've been making some changes to that recently because we've had some more ontology material coming out of ISO 3166, the country codes ontology. And we have geopolitical group as being a group of countries. Now, what I haven't thought of is framing that as being itself the kind of organization. That makes perfect sense. So I think if we want this to be included in the scope of this first release, I think that would be a really good improvement to the model. So thank you very much for that. Exactly what we want. Next slide. So then just pulling it together a little bit and adding some of the facts that, or properties, to give them a more accurate name, but the kinds of facts that define something or that follow from being something. Artificial persons, by virtue of the fact that they're created under some body of statute that defines the kind of instruments by which they're incorporated, they are of course constituted in some jurisdiction. This is jurisdiction, not country. I'm pretty confident of that. Everything around the legal side of things, but again, all feedback is very welcome. Generally, and this is where I'd like to perhaps find out a bit more from the legal details, most, or perhaps all, kinds of non-human legal persons have to have a legal name and have to have some registered address, that being the address upon which you serve papers on that entity. So I'd be interested to know whether that's necessarily true of every kind of artificial person by virtue of being an artificial person, or whether it's something we should simply articulate independently for incorporated company, for legal incorporated partnership, company limited by guarantee, and so on. So that's something we'd like to get more detail on. Also, just by the
Sorry,
by,
I'm going to interrupt again. Sorry, Mike, to interrupt. I just thought before you move on to the next thing, Phil Lee, surely we need to include sovereign governments, a type of legal entity, into this ontology. They are the major issuers of debt instruments and the only issuer of currencies, amongst other things.
Yes, thank you. I didn't include sovereign in these slides. It is in the model, and I'd like perhaps some legal input. I should have perhaps included them in the slides. as to whether they are a third kind of legal person or an extra kind of artificial person, or what. At the moment, I have them as a third kind of legal person. Sovereign is interesting because in many old world type of countries, the sovereign is vested in the person of some human being, so the king or queen or prince or emir of that country. In republics, by definition, the sovereign is the people, and that is what it means to be a republic. So the relationship between a sovereign as a legal person and natural persons is an interesting one. I'd like people's views on whether that should be in scope or out of scope for this release. As you rightly say, the sovereign is, well, the government on behalf of the sovereign issues the securities, but is the sovereign the party, the legal party on whose those securities are issued by? I believe it is. And that's something we would definitely like to articulate in more detail. So yes, thank you very much for that. And there's a whole set of, in fact, when we first were trying to define the scope of this, we decided that the whole government side of things was so complex we'd leave it for a future version. But that was some months ago, so this could well be that future version, because it is, we will need it for our securities work, very definitely. So things like government agencies, government as a thing in a role, the sovereign as the entity that it governs on behalf of, the holder of crown copyright, and so on.
Okay, so let's mark down that we've got an open issue on sovereign about how we treat it as artificial or natural or a separate category, and we need to be to look at that as one of the in-depth issues.
That's right. And the question on scoping, should we include that in this version? And I'd be inclined to think that we should, but I'd like people to.
Yeah, well, it sounds like clearly we should, since sovereign governments are debt issuers. But and Carol, you are keeping track of who's asking these questions, so we can go pick on them and find out what more they know.
Absolutely, I will have it all stored.
Good. Fantastic. That's exactly what we're after. So
you know, once again, as we do this, and if you think of something, if you are an expert in sovereigns and you want to help us figure out the answers to my question, please just send a note to Mike. Continue.
Fantastic. Thanks. So here we've defined some of the properties which, for example, incorporated companies must have, like a legal name and a registered address. Possibly those are necessarily true of every artificial person. We think it may be. We'd like to know. So that's one thing we could do with input on. Bearing in mind this doesn't include, of course, other kinds of legal entity like trusts and so on, which don't have to have legal names and registered address and so on. Interesting thing, in some jurisdictions, particularly bilingual jurisdictions like Belgium and Canada, you can actually have more than one legal name. So that was something we learned recently that is interesting. So yeah, these and now what we're trying to do here from a scoping perspective is to define what the folks at the DTCC call the different buckets into which kinds of legal person can fall. And we've tried to define, in other words, what kinds of mechanisms can exist for the creation of legal personhood and what kinds of legal person can exist across jurisdictions globally. There are open questions: are foundations legal persons or not? Or maybe that's something they are in some jurisdictions and not others. I've also heard recently that trusts, in some jurisdictions, there are kinds of trusts that can be legally incorporated, so we haven't got that. So I'd like to ensure that of all the mechanisms that can exist for being a legal person, that we've captured them all, given it the most general possible name or label, and of course, things like incorporated companies will have different stylings in different jurisdictions, but the concept of a company issued by the creation of shares is pretty much universal to every jurisdiction that I'm aware of.
Mike.
So, Arinish? Yeah.
Sheila Jeffrey has just asked, she's interested in how sub-funds can be included as legal entities. What legal capacities are exercised to create the sub-fund legal capability? Are sub-funds artificial persons? She doesn't see a placeholder for them in the ontology.
Right. Yeah. Again, with funds and fund-related entities, we started looking at it when we did the early draft of this and decided that this was one that needed detailed further review, because some funds are constituted as trusts. Some kinds of funds are a legal entity. Is the fund a kind of legal entity, or is the fund something defined by its role, and it has a constituted as property that says what kinds of things it must or must not be constituted as? That's a huge piece of work. We didn't think we'd be able to cover it for this release, but again, from a scoping point of view, if we feel we should have this in this first release, then we need a very detailed review around the whole area of collective investment vehicles and the kinds of entity which can be and which have roles within, like management companies and so on. We did a lot of work on collective investment vehicles themselves a couple of years ago with the European IFAMA, European Fund and Asset Management Association, and I'd see it as a possible future version that combines both the fund terms and the fund-related entity terms. But again, it's up to this group. If we want to try and include funding in the current scope, then we should consider that. But I'd be happy to show you the stuff we have so far for funds and for trusts and for various other kinds of thing around that.
Mike, I'm capturing funds as a critical separate conversation we are going to have before we release, so I got it.
Fantastic. Good. Thank you. Good, and it's a big one. It's an interesting one as well. And we've got some stuff, but this comes back to my next point, which is that when we looked at this a few months ago, we decided there were things, particularly things around countries and sovereigns and things around funds, which needed more knowledge than we had at that time around the table, and we were going to punt them into a future release. And we decided that the scope we would work around was that if we covered everything that was in this World Bank report called the Puppet Masters, which is a report on money laundering, then we would have the scope that we wanted. Now, of course, since then, it's really up to this group to decide, because the whole LEI and conversation has come up since then, really, and it's more up to this group to decide the scope. But in understanding the current scope of the draft we have at the moment, it's very much driven by what is or is not in that Puppet Masters report in terms of what kinds of entity that report describes. But as I say, it's really now up to this group to define what the scope should be for our current use cases.
10 minutes, Mike. Let's make sure we cover the things that we need to.
Right. Okay. Next slide. So organizations, and again, we've just defined one fairly simple fact that makes something an organization, which I've called a organization covering agreement. So we defined, again, a hierarchy of kinds of contracts. So this one lives in a taxonomy of contracts, and these contracts are the contracts between the principals of an organization. For some organizations like trusts, that contract has a very particular form and very particular roles that it defines and so on. For other kinds of organizations, some things like an incorporated company, you'll have a contract between the principals, between the directors, that's completely independent of its instrument of incorporation. This is the contract among the principals of something. And this we've defined as being what makes something a formal organization. So what it is that distinguishes things like partnerships and trusts and other things like incorporated companies and so on from informal organizations. And on the next session, we'll pick up whether we need to make more different distinctions between formal and informal, or distinguish different kinds of informal organizations and where to fit in things like organizations whose members are countries and stuff like that. But that's basically the basic concept by which we define an organization. So on the next slide, so there's really two things about organizations. One is that formality, that contract that makes it a formal organization. And here you see a taxonomy of all the kinds of things which, in addition to being legal entities and in many cases legal persons, are also formal organizations. And so, of course, it's the organization that defines something that's not an individual person in many ways. So a sole trader wouldn't be part of this hierarchy, for example. So on the next slide, right, yeah, good. Yeah, there's more about organizations I thought was next for some reason, which is how organizations have subparts and so on. So the two things about organizations are formal versus informal, with that formality, and the existence of sub-organizations, groups and branches and so But first, what we've done here is, having gone through these three distinct different concepts with different properties that define them, you'll see that most of the things we're interested in fall into two or more of those groups or sets. Remember, each of these items, each of these boxes on the diagram represents a set theoretic construct. So now we can say these are incorporated companies, companies limited by guarantee, foundations. I'd like to know more about foundations, whether we are right in thinking those are artificial persons or not. So, but what we've got here is the kind of resultant taxonomy, again, very different to what you might see in a data model, where you would extract a single taxonomy from this based on what you're interested in. You might be only interested in legal persons for, say, a loan-related database, or you might be only interested in legal entities for LEI, or for knowing what counterparties you may have in a contract or something, and so on. So this is the kind of the overall hierarchy. There's more subclasses of each of these as well, of course, but these are the basic. This is the basic structure of the model, based on the different properties that we just looked at that define legal personhood, formal organizations, legal entity capacity, and so on. So this is kind of the result of that. Next slide.
Mike, are you making a distinction between organisation and things like industry bodies, trade associations, marketplaces? These things are often covered by articles of association and introduce the concept of membership.
That's a very interesting point. Some of those, like an industry association, would be something defined by its role, because it's an industry association whether or not it's constituted as a legal entity, like a company incorporated by shares, or whether it's just an informal partnership. There's things like political parties, for example, which have hard to define concepts. But yeah, this is all things defined by their role, which we left out of these initial slides, but we do have a whole lot of
be a little careful. Associations are also legal entities. You work for one.
Yes, but it's not a legal entity because it's an association. It's a legal entity because it's a registered company, is it not?
Yeah, it's a registered non-profit company, right?
Exactly. So it's a registered non-profit company by its structure, and its role is it's an association. And some associations, it's a bit like non-profits. A non-profit can be a legal person, but it can also not be a legal person, but it's still a non-profit, and its registration as a non-profit is different. And I think there is a big difference here between the US and the UK, and I'm sure other jurisdictions differ as well in their own ways as to what kinds of entity can exist versus what is a non-profit, an association, and so on. So yeah, that's something we very much need to unpack when we look at things defined by their role in society, if you like non-profits. And of course, businesses are the flip side of non-profits. What kinds of form can a business take? Well, it can take any form, including a sole trader, for example.
Just a few minutes remaining, Mike. So let's get right on to it.
Yep, good. So so that was the overall hierarchy of the basic concepts, and then what we also have in the model is the detailed facts about various kinds of things. And here, as an example, we show some of the facts about incorporated companies. This includes things like their registered address versus business address, and so on, formal names, legal names, and so on, the jurisdiction under which they're registered, and so on. And also on the left here, there we start to see some of the stuff that is articulated in the next few slides, which is what are the kinds of things in a role that are parents, subsidiaries, part owners, and so on, in relation to that company, and specifically in relation to an incorporated company, because those particular relationships are based on the ownership of shares, and so of course can only apply to an incorporated company. They may well be similar relationships for other kinds of legal person, which we would also want to know about as well. So these are just some basic facts to give you some idea of what are the things we define. So then finally, we've only got a minute, but the next few slides are a kind of progression where we unpack what are the facts behind those relationships I just mentioned of ownership and subsidiary and so on. And these are one kind of relationship, and that is a kind of control, and it's a kind of control that arises from the ownership of shares. So you can own shares that are not voting shares, so you can have a beneficial owner that's just an owner, but you also have the owner of voting shares, which therefore has some degree of control. There are other kinds of control, and we'd like people's views on scope, whether we want to talk about the different kinds of control that exist, like management control and so on. We've got loads of them in the model, perhaps too many, and we want to know which ones to include. Obviously, this is the main one that we know is of interest. Now, if the thing which is a voting shareholder is itself a company, then you start to have the kind of relationship where the different levels of ownership or different percentage thresholds, you are a part owner, you have controlling stake, 50% plus one share, and so on. So as we go through those next few slides, I won't try and go through each one of them now, but I think you're seeing the basic thing there. That, in fact, if we stop at this slide, this is a good one. All of the other kinds of, yeah, perfect. All the other kinds of relationship, like part owner, like parent, and so on, are all based on different thresholds of ownership of shares in some company, voting shares in some company by some other company. And the combination of being the party which owns the shares and the identity of that party being a company, that pair of relationships then, you see this very complex thing in the middle here at the bottom, creates the simple relationship between one company and another, which is a relationship of ownership or a relationship of control. So in fact, for many applications, you could just leave out all the little stick men and you still have the relationships, but here we've defined what are the formal facts which bring those relationships about. So we particularly want to know, what other relationships like management control, the ability to appoint members of the board, those kinds of things, whether those should be in scope or not. But these are the basic ones that will allow us to define hierarchies of ownership, parentage, and a similar, without the control side, a similar beneficial ownership type of relationship, which we've also defined, which we'd like to hear more about. So slightly over time, sorry about that.
All right, so let's wrap up, Mike. So we're going to convene next Wednesday. I won't be here, but you're going to run it next Wednesday, 10 o'clock Eastern. We're going to start diving into things. People who have specific questions and comments, we absolutely encourage. Please call Mike directly, send him an email. We are focused on this right away. I heard 5 things, Mike. I think 4 or 5 things. Legal person, subclasses, agents all need to be looked at. The concept of sovereignty, sovereign governments. Funds. And the relationship of informal to formal organizations. I also heard person groups and how that relates to clubs and geopolitical positions and things of that nature.
Yes. That's a good one. So next week we'll dive into the actual model repository on screen and follow up many of these kinds of things. This is absolutely the kind of questions that we were hoping for and the kind of knowledge that we relying on this group to bring to the table, so that we're just the facilitators of have we represented the truth about things or not.
Can I also add in, just on again an organisational basis, because there was over 70 people, I think we got up to 84 people on this call. Next week's call will be again as a webinar to enable the number of people who are interested to join it. I will register everybody so that you will have new dial-ins for next week's call. Can I please ask if it is possible for you to connect using a telephone and not the voice over IP for the audio part? I can release your lines a lot easier. So if you can do that, that would be great. But please look out for the new dial-in details for next week's. It will be different from what we've used this week.
Okay, so thank you all very much. We're grateful for your interest and attention. We will be communicating, as Carol said, the logistics for next week. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank
So
you,
let's
Mike.
call this adjourned.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you, everybody.